I got home 18 minutes late after delivering the last order. The kitchen light was already on. My husband had just come back from work, sitting at the dining table, his jacket still on. The table was empty. The air felt heavy. He looked at the clock and then looked at me. Late again. I just finished a delivery, I said. I am sorry. He did not respond right away. He just sat there, as if waiting for something that should have already been there. I put my bag down and turned toward the kitchen, my hands moving faster. After a moment, he spoke, his voice even. I work all day to keep this house running. He paused for a beat. And the things you do, those are just secondary. I stood with my back to him. I heard it very clearly. Not the words one by one, but the attitude. And in that moment I understood. The problem was never dinner. It was my position in this house. This year I am in my 30s, married for many years. And from the outside, my marriage looks like what people usually call stable. No noise, no major incidents, no dramatic arguments, a tidy house, a regular routine. Everything moves on schedule, on time. Like a typical middle-class family in the American suburbs, where people believe that as long as everything runs smoothly, happiness will naturally be there. My husband works standard office hours. He is so used to fixed schedules that he almost never needs to look at a clock. Wake up time, leave the house time, get off work time, dinner time, rest time. Every part of his day has a clear place. To him, dinner is not just a meal, it is a marker, the proper ending to a proper workday. When dinner happens on time, he feels that the family is still operating according to plan, the way it is supposed to operate. I am different. I run a meal prep service for busy families in the area with weekly scheduled deliveries. I take orders myself, plan menus myself, prepare ingredients myself, cook everything myself, and deliver the meals myself. I cook in the afternoon. I deliver in the evening. My work has no office, no nameplate, no one tracking my hours, no coworkers to chat with during lunch breaks, but it is real work. For clients. And for me. When I first started doing this, my husband said he supported it. He told me to give it a try. Making a little extra money would be good. His tone was very calm. Not opposed, not overly encouraging, not enthusiastic. At the time, I thought this was the support of a mature adult, not making it difficult, not blocking the way. I believed that was enough. It was only later that I understood that in his mind what I did was never placed on the same level as his work. It was like a side job, a peripheral activity, nice to have, but if it did not exist, it would not affect the main axis of the family at all. That axis, in his thinking, had always been his work schedule, his hours, the rhythm of daily life revolving around him. For me, it was different. I had to plan menus that suited my clients' tastes while staying within budget. I had to calculate ingredients, portion them, pack the meals, label them, and clearly note delivery dates. I answered customer messages. I watched delivery times. Some days I stood in the kitchen for hours straight. There was nothing glamorous about it. No one praised me directly, but it was enough for me to feel that I was building something of my own, with my own hands and my own time. Life at that point still moved very smoothly. The house was still clean. The dining table was still set every night. I still tried to arrange my work so it would not affect my husband's familiar routine. I thought that was simply expected in a marriage. Giving in, adjusting, keeping everything from slipping out of place. I believed that a mature marriage did not need too much emotion. It just needed the right roles and the right rhythm. If someone had asked me then whether I saw any problems, I would have said no. No arguments. No tension, no harsh words, just a very faint feeling, very hard to name. Like standing in a room that was too neat, where everything was in its proper place, to the point that you did not know whether you were allowed to disturb anything at all. My husband would occasionally ask if I had any orders that day. The way he asked was very natural. When I said yes, he would just nod. He did not ask further. He was not curious about what I cooked, who I delivered to, where I went, or whether I was tired. The conversation stopped right there, like a question asked purely out of politeness. I did not blame him either. At the time, I even told myself that men usually do not pay attention to these things. I thought as long as he did not object, that was enough. But verbal support and real recognition are two different things. He allowed me to do it, but he never truly treated it as a serious part of our shared life. In his eyes, the main axis of the family still revolved around his work, his schedule, his rhythm of life. Everything else was just flexible, adjustable, something that could be placed second. I lived in that stability for quite a long time, long enough to get used to it, long enough to believe that this was how a good marriage functioned. I believed that if I just tried a little harder, organized things a little better, the two of us could still move forward together. I did not know that this was only the beginning. I knew even less that this very sense of smoothness was quietly pushing me into a lower and lower position in a way that was very polite, very reasonable, and very hard to notice until it started to hurt. If you are listening to this and it feels familiar, maybe you have also been in a marriage that looks stable on the outside, but quietly forces you to shrink a little more each day without knowing what to call that feeling. The first orders did not come all at once. They appeared scattered, without any clear pattern, a few orders a week, then a few orders a day. Not enough to be called busy, but enough to create small changes in the very fixed rhythm of this house. Changes so small that if you were not paying attention, you would think they did not matter. Some days I came home later than usual. Not by much, just 15 minutes. Some days 20 minutes. Some days I did not have time to cook fresh food and only reheated what had already been prepared earlier. Everything was still there, still clean, still edible, just not on time like before. And I thought that could not possibly be a problem. My husband came home from work in his familiar state. Tired, hungry, wanting to end the day with dinner at the right time. When he walked into the house and saw that the kitchen was not ready, I noticed the change immediately, not through words, but through very small details. The way he set his bag down more slowly, the way he opened the refrigerator and then closed it, the way he stood still in the kitchen for a few seconds, as if waiting for something that should have already been there. He did not say anything at first. He just sat down at the table, looked at the clock, then looked around the kitchen. The air felt strange at that moment, not clearly tense, but no longer comfortable like before. I stood in the kitchen, working while paying attention. A part of me began to feel that something was off, but not clearly enough to name it. After a few times like that, he started to speak, not to blame, not to nag. The comments were very light, so light that if you heard them in passing, you might think they were jokes. He said I was just doing these things for fun. He asked whether I could not even manage a proper dinner. He said those things while still sitting there waiting to eat. His voice was even, not raised, not harsh, but enough to make me feel that I was being put in a position where I had to explain myself, had to make up for it, had to apologize for something that had never been a problem before. I apologized, very quickly, very naturally, almost by reflex, like someone used to keeping the peace. I said, this was just the early stage. Orders were still scattered, the schedule was not stable yet. I would arrange things better. Everything would fall into place. I spoke without pausing, as if I needed to hear those words myself to feel reassured. I believed it. I truly believed it. I thought any new job needed time to get into rhythm. I thought if I just tried a little harder, everything would become smooth again. I did not see those comments as warning signs. I thought they were just temporary irritation from someone used to an old routine. From that day on, I started paying closer attention to time. I watched the clock while standing at the stove. I calculated delivery time so they would not run too late. Some days I finished cooking early and left everything ready on the stove, just waiting for him to come home so I could serve it. Some days I rushed to set the table the moment I got home, as if making up for a mistake I had not yet said out loud. But no matter how hard I tried, there were still evenings when things could not be perfectly on time. Clients called with extra requests. New orders came in. Deliveries were late because of traffic. Very ordinary things, very normal for anyone doing freelance work. But in this house, they began to turn into uncomfortable exceptions. My husband never said directly that he disliked it. He just repeated himself, gently, over and over. Every time dinner was late, it was a similar remark. Not harsher, but not softer either. Each sentence felt like a small mark, striking the same spot again and again. I began to feel that dinner was no longer just a meal. It became a test. Whether it was on time or not, whether it preserved his familiar routine or not, whether it disrupted the order he considered natural or not. I kept apologizing. I kept explaining. I kept telling myself this was only the early stage, that once everything stabilized, those comments would disappear. I did not see it as a serious problem. I thought that if I organized things better, everything would be fine. I did not realize that by this point, the problem was no longer about dinner. It was that for the first time in this marriage, my work had begun to collide with his comfort. And that collision, however small, made him stop seeing it as harmless. At that time, I still believed things would get better. I did not know that these late dinners were only the beginning, and that from then on, everything would no longer revolve around what time we ate, but around who had the right to disrupt whose rhythm. After the first late dinners, I began to adjust, not because I thought I was wrong, but because I believed this was only the early stage of a new job. I thought that if I organized things better, everything would settle again. I started waking up earlier, preparing dinner in advance, cooking ahead, portioning it out, storing it in the fridge. I did not want mealtimes to become an issue. I wanted to preserve the familiar rhythm of our household. I also began scheduling deliveries more carefully, calculating travel time, limiting how many evening orders I accepted, arranging things so I could still get home on time. I did everything very seriously, like someone trying to prove that she had control over her work and was not affecting anyone else. But as orders increased, things became harder to contain. Regular clients referred new ones. Some ordered every week. Some ordered for special occasions. The work was progressing, but the schedule tightened. All it took was one extra order, one additional call, one stretch of traffic, and every plan was pushed back. Even though I tried, there were still evenings when I could not be perfectly on time. Not many, but enough to repeat. And from there, my husband's attitude began to change. He was no longer just irritated by late meals. He began to treat his own schedule as the standard. The time he came home became the fixed point. Dinner time became something that should not shift. Everything in the house, in a very natural way, was expected to revolve around his schedule. No discussion, no agreement. If I came home late, it was because I had planned poorly. If dinner was late, it was because I had chosen the wrong priority. He never said that outright, but it was clear in his looks and in the long silences. Then he began asking about money, not to be informed, but to evaluate. How much I made in a day? How many orders in a week? I answered. He nodded, said nothing more, until another evening when he dropped a sentence very lightly. That I stayed busy all day and still did not bring home much. His voice was even, not raised, not angry. But that sentence did not invite debate. It was a conclusion. The time I spent, the effort I made, were reduced into a quick comparison. And the result, in his eyes, was that it was not worth much. From then on, he compared more often. The hours I spent in the kitchen against the money I earned, the effort I put in against the end-of-day result. No analysis needed, just a short conclusion. And each time, I felt my position being pushed a little lower. Some evenings, he would watch me clean up the kitchen and speak, as if offering reasonable advice, that if I did a little less, maybe everything would be less chaotic. That sentence was not a suggestion. It was an option already decided. In the way he looked at it, my part was the part that could be cut back, reduced, sacrificed to keep his rhythm of life unaffected. I did not argue. I did not want to turn everything into a debate about right and wrong. But I realized the problem was no longer about dinner. It had shifted to my value in this house. The sarcastic remarks began appearing more regularly. Not loudly, but repeatedly. Every time I came home late, every time dinner was not on time, every time his routine was disrupted, that I stayed busy all day and still did not bring home much. He said it like he was stating an obvious fact, and it was that calmness that made me see it clearly. To him, my work was not a profession that deserved respect. It was side work, and side work should not interfere with the main axis. I kept working. I kept waking up early. I kept preparing ahead, but I no longer felt like I was doing it for the family. I was doing it to prove that I was not useless. One thing became very clear to me. I was not being judged because I was lazy. I was being judged because I no longer revolved around him the way I used to. And once I stopped placing his comfort first, every effort I made became a mistake. From there, I understood that this conflict could not be solved by cooking earlier or coming home on time. It lay in the way he saw me. And that gaze had begun to frame me into a lower position in a way that was steady, reasonable, and very hard to argue against. That evening began like any other. There were no warning signs. No tension carried over from the day. My husband came home on time as usual, without saying anything, as if his schedule never needed updating. I was delivering the last order, an extra order that came up unexpectedly. I hesitated for a few seconds and then accepted it, thinking I would still make it home in time. I miscalculated. When I walked into the house, the kitchen was not finished. The food was still at the final stage. The clock had already passed our usual dinner time. The kitchen light was on. My husband was already sitting at the table, still wearing his jacket, doing nothing except waiting. I put my bag down, apologized out of reflex, then turned back to the kitchen. I moved faster than usual, not because I was afraid, but because I had grown used to making up for it every time the routine slipped. The air at that moment was no longer mild irritation. It was heavy and silent. A kind of silence that signaled this was no longer just about dinner. I heard him begin to reorganize everything in a very orderly way. He said his job was the main part, and mine was flexible. Who was the one keeping the family running steadily? Who was carrying the main responsibility? And in that order, what I was doing was placed to the side, like something outside the center. I stood with my back to the table. My hands were still busy. I did not turn around. Not because I was angry, but because I needed a few seconds to understand what had just happened. This was no longer scattered remarks, no longer light sarcasm. This was the first time I was placed clearly lower. The way he spoke was not aggressive, but the content was decisive. His work was the main axis. My work was secondary. And what was secondary should not disrupt order. What was secondary could be adjusted, reduced, or sacrificed when needed. I heard very clearly how my work was being named, not as a profession, not as a serious effort, but as something on the side, nice to have, unnecessary to the stability of the family. I turned to look at him. For the first time that evening, I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not explain. I understood that if I opened my mouth at that moment, I would have to prove that I had the right to exist on equal ground in my own home, and I was tired of doing that. What followed did not introduce anything new. It only reinforced the same conclusion, that a family needed to operate on a fixed rhythm. That rhythm had already been stable, and what I was doing was disrupting that familiar order. There were no direct insults. No words sharp enough to cause an explosion, but the message was clear. I was the part that could be adjusted to keep everything the way it was. At that moment, I realized I was no longer standing inside an argument. I was standing in front of an evaluation, and the conclusion had already been decided. I had no space to argue back, because every argument would circle back to one single point. I was disrupting his sense of stability. Dinner was not served that night. I turned off the stove, took off my jacket, went into the bedroom. I did not slam the door. I did not make any noise. Everything happened in a very orderly way, exactly like this marriage had operated for many years. But something had broken, not because he believed his work was important, but because he used that belief to place my work beneath his. Not because he needed stability, but because that stability only had room for one person at the center. Lying in bed that night, I did not cry. I was not angry. I thought about all the times I had apologized before. The times I had made my work smaller to make it easier to accept. The times I had tried to keep everything from shifting out of place. I understood that none of that brought us closer. It only lowered my position little by little. There was no reconciliation that night, no comforting words, and none were needed. Because from the moment my work was placed into the secondary category, a boundary had been crossed. Some things, once spoken calmly, cannot be taken back. Not because they are too harsh, but because they reveal what has existed for a long time in the speaker's mind. From that night on, I understood that this marriage had reached a very clear point. Not a point of explosion, but a point where I was no longer seen as an equal. And once that happens, every effort afterward becomes nothing more than prolonging a structure that is already fundamentally misaligned. After that evening, there were no more major conversations in the house, no reconciliation, no revisiting it. Everything continued as usual. We still ate, lived, and talked about what needed to be talked about. But I knew very clearly that something had shifted position. And if I kept apologizing, I would be the one keeping myself in that position. I stopped apologizing. It was not a decision I announced, not a declaration. It happened quietly. I simply stopped apologizing every time I came home late. I stopped giving long explanations for why I was busy. I stopped saying things in advance to downplay my work just to avoid discomfort. When I came home late, I said I had a delivery. When dinner was not ready, I said I was still working on it. I spoke briefly, enough information. No extra soothing words. I no longer felt the need to make up for what I was doing. I also stopped calling my work side work. I no longer said it was just for fun. I no longer said it was just extra money. I called it what it was. Work, orders, regular clients, delivery schedules. I spoke calmly, as if it were self-evident. Not challenging, but not diminishing either. The first thing I did was separate my finances. Very quietly. No announcement, no argument. I opened a separate account. I transferred my income there. I still contributed to shared expenses as before. Housing, utilities, daily costs. Everything was clear, nothing missing. But what I earned, I kept for myself. I began keeping careful records, tracking expenses, tracking profit, recalculating prices, adjusting menus. I was not doing it to prove anything to anyone. I was doing it to know exactly where this work was taking me. For the first time, I did not have to guess my own value. I also stopped forcing my delivery schedule to match his timing perfectly. I still tried not to come home too late, but I was no longer afraid of being late. If I was busy, I was busy. If I was late, I was late. I stopped feeling guilty about it. My husband noticed very quickly, not because I said anything, but because I stopped doing the familiar things. I did not apologize in advance. I did not try to smooth things over when he was displeased. I did not proactively make myself smaller. I remained calm, polite, but I no longer lowered myself. There were times when he seemed unhappy. He did not say it directly, but it showed in his silence, in the way he moved around the house, in the way he looked at me, as if measuring. I noticed it, but I did not adjust the way I used to. Once, he asked why I seemed colder lately. I said I was not cold. I was just busy. I said it plainly. No sarcasm. No confrontation. But that answer left the house quiet for a long time. I focused more on my work. Not recklessly, but deliberately. I filtered orders, prioritized regular clients, took on stable contracts. Every decision was based on numbers, not on emotion. I gradually realized something very clearly. Before, the rhythm of the house stayed stable not because everything naturally ran smoothly, but because I was the one adjusting. When I stopped doing that, the old rhythm began to slip. Dinner was still late sometimes, but it was no longer the center of the issue. His irritation shifted to other things, to the fact that I had my own schedule, my own plans, the calls I had to take, the messages I had to answer. I was no longer home and ready, waiting. I was not trying to create distance, but distance appeared naturally once I stopped revolving around him. There were evenings when he came home earlier, looked around the house, saw that I was not back yet. He did not say anything, but I could sense the uncertainty. Not because he was hungry, but because for the first time, he was no longer sure that everything was still waiting for him the way it used to. I still behaved normally. Not cold, not confrontational. I still spoke when needed, still shared household matters. But I no longer adjusted myself to make him feel comfortable. From the moment I stopped apologizing, this marriage no longer functioned the old way. It did not collapse immediately. There was no obvious incident, but it began to crack at a very specific point. I no longer stood lower to keep the peace. I began living as an equal. And that alone exposed a truth that had existed for a long time. This marriage only ran smoothly when I agreed to make myself smaller. From the moment I stopped doing that, everything began to slip, quietly, but with no way back. After I stopped apologizing, nothing in the house fell apart right away. There were no major arguments, no prolonged, tense silence. Only the familiar daily rhythm began to drift, little by little. And this time, the drift was not corrected. Before, if dinner was late, I would find a way to compensate. If a delivery schedule collided with our shared routine, I would adjust. If something made him uncomfortable, I was usually the first to notice. This time, I was not. I was no longer the one holding the rhythm. Meals stopped happening at consistent times. Some days I came home early, some days late. I did not give advance notice the way I used to. Not because I was doing it on purpose, but because I no longer saw it as an obligation to explain myself. I finished my work, then I came home. My husband began to look unsettled, not openly angry, but no longer at ease. Some evenings he waited. Some evenings he ate first. Some evenings he skipped dinner. I noticed it, but I did not intervene. The atmosphere in the house became strange, not tense, but hollow. No one took the lead to push things back into the old rhythm. And for the first time, I realized that the old rhythm existed because of me. He began asking more about my schedule, not out of concern, but to anticipate it. I answered briefly. Enough information. No details. No extra explanation. I no longer felt like I was reporting. Small things started to show. Items were not placed back in their usual spots. Household tasks were no longer completed before he came home. Small gaps appeared in daily life. No one mentioned them, but they accumulated. I was not trying to create change. I was simply living at my own pace. But when one person stops adjusting, the whole structure reveals its weakness. And that weakness was not in me. There were evenings when he came home earlier, looked around, said nothing. I knew he was searching for a familiar order, but that order was no longer being maintained by my silence. I was not cold. I still did my part, still contributed, still shared responsibilities, but I no longer did the invisible extra work of adjusting to keep everything smooth. From that point on, I understood very clearly. This marriage did not have a problem because I was busy. It had a problem because only one person had been doing the adjusting. And the moment that person stopped, the imbalance showed itself immediately. The contempt in this marriage did not appear suddenly. It had been there for a long time. It was just that before, it was covered by my adjustments. When I stopped adjusting, it became very clear. Not through insults, not through arguments, but through attitude. He began to see my being busy as an inconvenience. He did not say it outright, but he showed it through his looks, through long stretches of silence, through the way he handled shared matters without waiting for me anymore. I realized I was no longer considered a central part of everyday decisions. My work continued to be treated as something that could be pushed aside, no longer hidden, no longer softened with words. Just an assumption that if there was a conflict, my part would be the one to step back. I did not react, not because I did not see it, but because I saw the nature of it clearly. When someone does not see your effort as having value, every explanation becomes unnecessary. Our exchanges grew shorter, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was no longer equal ground. I stopped sharing long-term plans. I stopped talking about work goals, not because I was hiding them, but because I knew they would not be considered important. He began talking more about inconvenience, about disrupted routines, about time no longer being fixed. These things were stated as obvious facts, with no consideration for how I felt. I listened, and I understood. Contempt does not need raised voices. It only needs to be repeated long enough through attitude. I realized something else as well. I no longer hurt the way I used to. I no longer tried to fix things. I no longer wanted to explain. When you have stood too long in a lowered position, the moment you stand upright, everything becomes very clear. This marriage was no longer a place where I wanted to keep adjusting, not because I was selfish, but because I was no longer seen as an equal. From there, the decision to divorce was no longer a vague thought. It became a logical option, not emotional, not impulsive. Just the next step when a structure no longer fits. I did not say it out loud right away. I observed longer, not to look for reasons, but to make sure I was no longer mistaken. And the more I observed, the clearer it became. Contempt had become the foundation of this marriage. Once that was clear, I knew I would not stay much longer. Our divorce did not involve an affair. No violence. No one was caught in the act. There was no explosive moment dramatic enough for outsiders to remember. It unfolded exactly the way this marriage had existed for many years. Orderly, quiet, and final. I was the one who spoke first, not in anger, not after an argument, just a short conversation, when everything was already clear enough that no further reasons were needed. I said I wanted to end it. No long explanations, no list of faults. I no longer needed to persuade anyone. He was silent for quite a while. He did not ask why. He did not argue. He only asked procedural questions. When? How it would be handled? How things would be divided? The way he asked felt more like handling a task that needed to be completed than a relationship coming to an end. I realized that by that point, both of us were tired of trying to understand each other. The paperwork was prepared quickly, not because we were rushing, but because there was nothing left to negotiate emotionally. Our finances had already been separated. Contributions were clear. There were no major disputes. No feeling of losing something that no longer truly belonged to me. We signed the divorce papers on a very ordinary morning. No tears, no promises, no final words meant to hold anything back. 2 signatures placed neatly down, like ending a contract that had expired long ago. I moved out with that same sense of order. I did not carry resentment. I did not carry a sense of winning or losing. I only carried a very clear feeling of relief. Relief, because for the first time in many years, I no longer had to adjust myself to fit someone else. He did not try to stop me. He did not object. He did not accuse. He stood and watched me pack my things, asked a few necessary questions, kept a polite distance, the same distance he had always kept once things were outside his familiar control. After that, each of us stepped out of the marriage in our own way. No one won. No one lost in the usual sense. But there was one difference that I saw immediately. I stepped out with the sense that I had grown within that marriage. Not because I endured well, but because I learned to call my work by its proper name, to call my value by its proper name, and to stand on equal ground without asking permission. He did not step out the same way. He needed a familiar order, a rhythm of life where everything revolved around his schedule and comfort. When that order disappeared, he did not have another structure ready to replace it, and he was not accustomed to adjusting himself for another person. This divorce was not loud, but it was the inevitable result of something repeated for too long. Small contempt, quiet, but constant. It does not destroy a relationship in a single day. It erodes it slowly until there is no shared ground left. I did not leave in bitterness. I did not stay in silence either. I left when everything was clear, when there were no questions left to answer. And when I stepped out, I did not carry the need to prove that I was right. I only carried my own life. In the literal sense, some marriages do not end because of a major incident. They end because an order no longer fits. When one person has to make themselves smaller for too long to keep the peace, sooner or later, they will walk away. That is how our divorce happened. Not dramatic. Not outwardly painful, but clear enough that neither of us wanted to go back. After the divorce, we did not cut off all contact, not because of lingering attachment, but because there were still shared matters that needed to be completed. Mail, bills, a few documents still under the old names. All communication was brief, clear, and strictly purposeful. No questions about personal life, no curiosity, no detours. My life stabilized very quickly, not because I had some grand plan ready, but because I no longer had to revolve around anyone. My work schedule became cleaner, my income more consistent. I chose orders more carefully. When I came home late in the evening, I no longer felt like I was doing something wrong. I lived at my own pace, and that pace did not require anyone's permission. He was not the same. I do not know exactly when it began, but I noticed the change through short messages. At first, they were about very small things, whether a document had been sent, a payment that needed confirmation. Later, the questions were no longer necessary. Was I doing well? How work had been lately? Those questions came later than they should have and appeared at unusual hours. I replied politely, briefly, with enough information. I did not open new conversations. I was not annoyed, but I did not step back into the old role either. The role of keeping the rhythm, of smoothing things over, of being there for him to lean on when things felt empty. There was one time we met again to sign a remaining document. The meeting was short. No coffee. No staying to talk. Just enough time to sign and confirm. He arrived earlier, looked at me for a long moment before saying what needed to be said. I recognized that look, not romantic regret, but the confusion of someone seeing, for the first time, that a familiar order was no longer functioning. He talked more than necessary, about changes at home, about dinner no longer being on a fixed schedule, about things often running late. I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not react. I was no longer in the position of fixing that rhythm for him. I realized that in this marriage, he had never learned how to adjust himself. He was used to having someone else do it for him. When that person left, the emptiness appeared very quickly. After that meeting, the messages came more often. Not all at once, but regularly. Some did not require a reply. I answered what was related to paperwork. The rest, I let pass. Not out of anger, but because I no longer had a responsibility to fill his sense of absence. I did not feel satisfied seeing him slow down. I did not feel like I had won. I only saw clearly something I had never faced directly before. He did not lose me because I changed too much. He lost me because he had never seen my adjusting as an effort that deserved appreciation. Some things are only noticed when they disappear, not because they were once extraordinary, but because people grow used to treating them as given. He began to realize it when things were no longer on time, when there was no one reminding, no one organizing, no one automatically making everything run smoothly. And when he realized it, the old structure was already gone. I did not say any of this to him. I did not need him to acknowledge it either. I did not leave this marriage to wait for a delayed understanding. My life after divorce was not radiant. There was no dramatic reversal. It was simply calm. And for the first time, that calm did not come from me making myself smaller. He, on the other hand, began to slow down. Not collapse, but hesitate. And that hesitation said more than any apology ever could. Some realizations only come after everything has ended, not because people are intentionally slow to understand, but because when they are still inside a familiar structure, they have no reason to look back at themselves. By the time he realized it, I had already gone far enough that there was no reason to turn back. After the divorce, my life did not change in the way people often imagine. There was no dramatic sense of liberation, no burst of happiness. Just a different rhythm, clearer, where I no longer had to adjust myself to fit anyone else. I moved into a small apartment. Simple, bright, quiet. I did not need many things. I did not need to arrange my space around someone else's habits. I put everything where it felt convenient to me. I cooked when I wanted. Some days very early, some days very late. And for the first time in many years, dinner was no longer a checkpoint used to measure whether I had fulfilled my role. My work settled into a steady pace. Not fast, not explosive, but consistent. I had regular clients, a clear delivery schedule. I knew how much I earned. I knew how I spent my money. I did not have to explain why I was busy. I did not need permission to come home late. I did not call that success. I called it being in the right place. The last remaining ties between us were removed cleanly. Paperwork completed. Accounts separated. There was no reason left for me to return. Everything ended in the same way the marriage had operated for many years. Orderly, quiet, final. I heard from acquaintances that he still lived in the old house. His routine was no longer fixed. Meals were irregular. Some nights very early, some nights very late. I did not ask more. Not because I was indifferent, but because I was no longer in a position where it was my concern. There was one rare time we ran into each other by chance. No appointment, no preparation. We greeted each other politely, exchanged a few courteous words. We did not bring up the past. We did not reopen memories. I noticed he looked at me differently, less certain, less familiar, but I did not stay to analyze that look. I did not need a late realization. I did not leave to wait for him to change. I did not leave to prove that I was right. I left because I had been in a structure where my position kept getting lower, and I no longer wanted to live inside that structure. Looking back, I do not think this marriage ended because of a major incident. It ended because of a habit repeated for too long. The habit of treating my work as secondary, the habit of treating my adjustments as a given, the habit of letting me stand lower so everything could stay calm. No one was entirely right, no one was entirely wrong, but there are relationships that only exist when one person agrees to make themselves smaller. And when that person stops doing so, the relationship has no way to continue. I do not blame him. I also do not blame myself. I understand that we lived inside an order that was no longer right for us, and I was the first to recognize it. I recognized it early enough to stop before I completely disappeared into the role of someone who always had to apologize. This marriage taught me one very simple thing. Not about sacrifice, not about endurance, but about position. When you have to constantly apologize for your own existence, it is no longer an equal relationship, and when you have to explain your value every day, you are standing in the wrong place. Now I live in my own rhythm. No need to prove anything. No need to compare. I work when I need to. I rest when I am tired. I no longer feel like I am inconveniencing anyone just because I am busy. These things sound small, but to me, they are freedom. There are some breakups that do not leave deep wounds. They only leave a silence long enough for someone to see how long they have been standing in the wrong place. And once that becomes clear, there is no desire to go back. I did not walk away in bitterness. I did not walk away in triumph. I walked away with clarity, clear about my position, clear about my boundaries, and clear about what I will no longer accept. I did not lose a perfect marriage. I simply left a structure that no longer had room for me to stand upright. And once everything was put back in its proper place, I did not need to look back. That was enough. This story did not fall apart because of late dinners, but because of quiet contempt repeated every day. When a person's work and effort are always treated as secondary, she slowly makes herself smaller to fit. And the moment she stops apologizing, she does not make a scene, she simply stands up straight. That is when everything becomes clear. The marriage was only calm when she agreed to stand lower. If you have ever had to apologize just for being busy, leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and how you once made yourself smaller. Like the video and subscribe to the channel to hear more family stories that are real, cold, and clear enough to know when it is time to walk away.